You're listening to Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast, where we dive into holistic nutrition, biomedical treatments, functional medicine, low toxicant living, and developmental strategies with a special focus on children with complex picky eating, developmental delays, and neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm your host, Shandy Laskey, integrative speech-language pathologist, pediatric feeding specialist, functional nutritional therapy practitioner, and epidemic answers certified health coach. Together, we are changing the conversation around how we view, discuss, prevent, and treat these childhood epidemics. I am so honored to have your time and attention today. Thank you for joining me and for all of your support. Please note that this podcast is for educational purposes only and should never be misconstrued as medical advice or a replacement for individualized care from your trusted providers. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. Hello there. Thank you for tuning in today to episode 4 of Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast. I want to just say thank you so much for the support so far. When I launched the podcast, I wasn't really sure what type of engagement and support and all of that I would get, but I have been overwhelmed by the support that I've gotten, and I'm excited to continue to get further into this podcasting journey and really get into more educational content that can support your family or your clients. And so we're going to get into it today. I am talking to you all about picky eating. I often use the term complex picky eating, and when I say complex picky eating, what I mean is atypical, not normal. Pickier than what would be considered developmentally appropriate. But that's the challenge with picky eating. And when I say picky eating, I just picture me over here doing air quotes when I do it, because I don't love the term. A lot of feeding specialists will say that as well. They don't love the term because it's not a diagnosis. It's not a standard term. It's just a very general term that we use. And with the rise of children who are more complex picky eaters, or children who have feeding disorders, which we are going to get into, those children sometimes go overlooked, or they're bounced around, or they don't always get the help that they need immediately or as soon as they need it, because it's disregarded as, oh, that's just picky eating. Like, oh, that's just normal. So I want to go into what's normal and what's not normal. So there is a typical stage of development in the toddler through preschool years where a child will experience fear of new foods. Some people refer to this as food neophobia, but I've also seen some experts say they don't love the term food neophobia because we're making it sound like this normal developmental stage is a phobia, right? We're like psychopathologizing it. And so anyways, but that's what it sometimes is referred to. And all it basically means is that it is a typical stage of development within those toddler years to preschool years, where when a child comes into contact with a new food or a food that's not very familiar, it's not unusual for them to be skeptical of it, for them to exhibit some forms of picky eating. You may or may not have heard that statistic or that quote that it takes or can take up to 15 exposures of a food before a child will be willing to try it. When they studied that, when that study was done, that was on children who are typically developing, was my understanding. So if you have a child who would fall in the realm of a pediatric feeding disorder or a quote-unquote problem feeder or complex picky eating or extreme picky eating, you know what I'm saying, that non-developmentally appropriate picky eating, then you can anticipate that exposure, the amount of exposures, is going to need to be increased. And perhaps, most likely, you're going to need to take a more focused approach on helping your child feel more comfortable with foods, with being able to try these new foods, and looking at these other factors that might be going on, playing a role in this more complex issue, right? So then that's really what I want to talk about today, is what makes complex picky eating complex. And there is no way that I'm going to be able to cover the whole gamut of it all today, because it's complex, it is. But I'm going to do my best. And I hope that you will at least come away after this episode knowing whether or not your child's picky eating is more of a appropriate developmental stage or phase that they're in, or is it something more complex that you might want to consult with someone about. If you are a fellow feeding specialist, or if you're familiar with the world of feeding therapy, you probably are familiar with the work of Dr. Kay Toomey. But just in case you're not, which I'm willing to bet a majority of you may not be if you're listening into this episode, I'm going to guess that you're new to all of this. So let me tell you a little bit more about the work of Dr. Kay Toomey and why I bring her up. So she is the developer of the SOS approach to feeding, which stands for Sequential Oral Sensory Approach to Feeding. She is a psychologist who has worked in the field of feeding therapy for a couple decades now, and has done some really incredible work. And she has this list that you can find on her website just by searching SOS approach to feeding. Or you can search picky eating versus problem feeding, and this will come up. But we're going to talk a little bit more about how she outlines this the way to distinguish this. So let's go through this. So for picky eaters, remember, this is a more developmental phase, and typically, if there isn't another underlying issue or condition or something else going on, which we're going to talk a little bit more about next, but typically, if a child is developing accordingly, then the picky eating that's developmentally appropriate should just kind of phase out after that preschool age, right? But how we respond to those behaviors can influence whether or not it spirals into something more. That being said, oftentimes there's something else going on, which we're going to talk about. But first, let's break down picky eaters versus problem feeders. Now, if you are hearing me talk about problem feeders and it sounds like your child, if it's resonating with you, I do advise you to follow up and speak with someone, whether that's me or a local therapist to you in your area, or someone who is knowledgeable, who can tell you, yes, you need to see a professional, here is the person you should see. Please do that. So here we go. Picky eaters. They would usually have at least 30 different foods. They have a decreased range or like a decreased variety, but they're going to have at least 30 foods. Versus problem feeders are going to have a more restricted range or variety of foods. They're going to have less than 20 different foods. And sometimes kids do these like food jags or food burnouts where they really love a food and it's one of their favorite foods or a food that they like, they eat often, no problem with, and then all of a sudden they're not having it anymore. Like they're just done with it. For problem feeders, those foods are generally not able to be reintroduced back in very easily versus a kid who's going through a more typical phase of picky eating during those toddler and preschool years. They might have a food that they all of a sudden say they're not into anymore, but a week or two later, they introduce it back. That's more typical versus a kiddo who's like, no, I don't want this anymore, and they mean it, and it's not coming back for a while. A kid who would be considered a problem feeder would be a kiddo who just has a total meltdown, or when these new foods are presented to them, they are going to go through a complete refusal, and often they will eliminate entire categories and food groups based on the texture of the food or the nutritional category that it fits into. So fat, carb, protein, meats, like or you know what I'm saying, where they have like a certain pattern where they'll eliminate a category based on something. A kiddo who's a picky eater, they can tolerate new foods on their plate. They usually might touch them or taste them. Even if they're a little bit hesitant, they might not eat much. Sometimes they may not eat it at all. Sometimes they may not touch it at all. But it's not going to be like this huge emotional issue for them. It's not going to cause emotional distress. Usually what I say when someone's like, how do you know if your child is a complex picky eater, Shandy? I say, you will know. You will not have to ask me, because the parents who come to me of children with complex picky eating, they know that it is complex because it is impacting their quality of life. And because it's causing concerns about their child's health, wellness, and development. They know that their child's limited food repertoire is not as nutritionally dense as it should be and could be. So back to picky eaters versus problem feeders. The last couple things I just wanted to note here that Dr. K. Toomey makes on her list. She says a picky eater, sometimes, they'll eat different foods than the rest of the family, but they'll typically eat with the family. Sometimes they eat different foods, sometimes they don't, but they'll at least be at the table. Versus a problem feeder, these children almost always are having to eat different foods, sometimes an entirely different meal than the rest of the family. Sometimes the family's food bothers these children. They don't want to be in the sight or within the smell or like even in the presence of these other foods that aren't even on their plates. They almost always, or they often, do not eat with the family. Problem feeders are persistently reported by the parents as picky eaters at their pediatrician appointments, and a kiddo who might be a more picky eater, developmentally appropriate picky eater, they might just be sometimes reported as a picky eater versus like consistently every single time. When it is becoming a concern, it is a concern and would fall more so in that problem feeder category. So as I have previously mentioned, the picky eating term is not a standard term. It's not a standard diagnosis. And either is the term problem feeder. But a lot of pediatric feeding specialists have come to know that term through the work of Dr. K. Toomey. But also now there has been more new advancements in the field, I suppose you'd say, where we are now looking at a formal official diagnosis thanks to the professionals in the field like Dr. K. Toomey and the incredible people in the organization Feeding Matters. These people have been working so hard to put forth the research and get a standard term in place. And thanks to Feeding Matters, I believe later this year that term diagnosis, pediatric feeding disorder, will officially start being used later this year. And I want to read you what their definition is. So first, the stat, they say more than 2.3 million children under the age of 5 in the United States each year is diagnosed with a pediatric feeding disorder, or it affects more than 2.3 children under the age of 5 each year. And it's defined as impaired oral intake that is not age appropriate and is associated with medical, nutritional, feeding skill, or psychosocial dysfunction. And I think that that's so spot on for a definition because it really encompasses the overlap of the different categories and considerations and the areas of concern that come into play when we're talking about pediatric feeding disorder. So when I say complex picky eating, most of those kiddos might probably fall within that pediatric feeding disorder diagnosis. I continue to use the complex picky eating term because I'm a parent coach, and so that's the term that parents are searching for on the internet because they may not have heard the pediatric feeding disorder term yet. But as a professional, I'm very excited about that term and really grateful for the work that has gone into getting this diagnosis. Inspired by this coordinated care model of pediatric feeding disorder that has been put forth by Feeding Matters, I broke it down into the way that I think about complex picky eating in terms of being able to explain it to my community. And this is a Venn diagram where I have created a Venn diagram of that I call the picky eating paradigm, because I often say that I'm trying to create a picky eating paradigm shift. And so this is a new paradigm. And I created this for my course that I've been working on, which is such a labor of love that I am excited to share with you all when it's done in the future, Naturally Navigating Picky Eating. But yes, so this is the picky eating paradigm. I have not shared it yet. This is the exclusive premiere where I am talking about it and sharing about it. But imagine, if you will, a Venn diagram. So if it's been a while for you since you've heard this term Venn diagram, it's where all the circles are overlapping, okay? So imagine 5 circles overlapping as if it's making a flower shape, okay? And all of the circles in the Venn diagram are overlapping. In the middle, picky eating paradigm, okay? Each circle is representative of a category, but each circle is overlapping with every other circle, okay? Every category overlaps every other category, meaning within this picky eating paradigm, what I'm trying to get across with the Venn diagram is that it's never just one isolated this or that. It's always a very interconnected, overlapping, more complex issue within this picky eating paradigm, okay? So the categories are trauma, medical, structural functional, that's one, structural functional, biochemical nutritional is one, and behavioral environmental. And the way that I want to just briefly break these down today are there are different issues in each one of these categories or situations that come up where, again, it's not just one isolated issue. So, okay, let's think about medical reasons of more complex picky eating, problem feeding, pediatric feeding disorder, what have you, okay? These more not developmentally appropriate challenges where picky eating is becoming more of a concern for the family, right? It's impacting their family's quality of life. Usually, when it's a medical issue, a lot of families might know that already. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It depends on what's going on, right? So this might look like, is the child having reflux? Is there already a condition or diagnosis that the child already has, whether it's genetic or, something else that could be contributing to complex picky eating? For structural functional issues, could it be that they have a oral motor challenge, right? Where it's difficult for their brain to send the message to the mouth to make the movements that are needed to properly, safely chew and swallow this food? Is it possible that they have some sort of structural or functional, anatomical, physiological something going on that is contributing to their mouth development, to their mouth movements, which is then impacting meal times, feeding and swallowing in some different way? For example, if a child has a tongue tie, it may be impacting their ability to get proper resting position of their mouth during the day and or at night, which then, because their tongue is not reaching the palate, it's not able to properly form the palate, and then the palate, which should be more of like a rainbow upside down U shape, it goes into more of a concave, deeper, high arched, narrow shape, right? And as that goes up, as that palate goes higher, it becomes more difficult for the tongue to get that closure, right? So then there can be different issues that occur after that, right? And picky eating could be one of those issues if a child does not feel safe enough to properly chew and swallow certain food textures, right? But sometimes it might not be something like a tongue tie. Maybe it's something like they have an allergy, okay? So this is the overlap between medical and biochemical, nutritional, and structural, functional, in all of them, right? Like this is a perfect example of how all of these overlap. Say you've got a kiddo who has some sort of allergy to something, and a food they're eating, something in their home, what have you, okay? And they are stuffy and really congested, right? And they can't breathe through their nose. They're going to start breathing more and more through their mouth. And it might change their oral microbiome health, which then changes their gut health, which then changes what they're craving. Also, having your mouth open like that, you're not getting that tongue to palate contact. You're not closing your mouth. I mean, you're changing a lot. As a speech language pathologist, pediatric feeding specialist, here are some of the things that I'm looking for within that structural functional category as it relates to the picky eating paradigm. I'm wondering more about your child's oral motor development and skills. I'm wondering about their sensory needs, and any sorts of sensory aversions, any textures, flavors, smells, sights, colors, you name it, any sensory aspects of food and meal times that they are not able to handle. That would fall under that structural functional category, and I would want to know about that. Oral motor, again, I'm thinking about how are they moving their mouths? How are they sending the signals from their brains to their mouths? So we've got gross motor, fine motor, and then oral motor is like the finest fine motor that we have. Other structural functional issues may not be just related to the mouth. It may be that your child's high chair is improperly positioned, where it's tilting their pelvis and it's creating an unsupportive position for meal times. So that right there is a structural functional issue where it's going to impact their whole body, which then impacts their stability and their core strength. And when a kiddo is little, they don't have a lot of core strength. So if they're not properly seated in their high chair or in their chair for mealtime, whether it's a high chair or not, if they're not in the proper seating, they're not going to have the proper support physically to have that brain power, if you, for lack of better words right now, the irony, that brain power to handle that meal, especially if they have more complex picky eating needs that are structural, functional going on in their mouth, because their cognitive capacity, their attention is going to be focused more on stabilizing their core and stabilizing their body rather than the meal. So I'll get into the proper positioning towards the end when I go through some quick tips that are starting point strategies. But to go into the biochemical and nutritional area of picky eating paradigm a little bit deeper, this is the area that I'm particularly fascinated by as a functional nutritional therapy practitioner. And I find that a lot of kiddos right now are struggling with these biochemical, nutritional aspects of picky eating, and it's going overlooked because of the more conventional models around nutrition. So in episode 3, I talked about all about holistic nutrition and looking at looking at what food additives are in our food and these different things. You can reference all of that back in episode 3, like I said, but these food additives that I talked about that are generally recognized as safe by the FDA, but I bet if you took a look at them, you may not choose that they were safe for your family. Maybe not. But for example, some food dyes that are commonly found in the standard American diet for children are derived from petroleum. And I bet that a lot of parents would not choose petroleum-derived products if they knew that it was derived from petroleum and linked to health, development, and just all these different issues for children, right? So we're seeing an increase of kiddos who, for lack of better words, are biochemically, like physically addicted to certain foods for various reasons. So sometimes when there is a food intolerance or a food sensitivity to different ingredients, whether that's a food additive or sometimes it's not a food additive. Sometimes it is literally just a molecule, a substance found within even foods that are healthy foods, like glutamates, amines, salicylates, different things like that, which that's like getting way deeper into nutrition than I intend to go in this episode. But for me, I'm now able to look at a child's food mood journal, their food list, and I can pick out patterns where they may be having a difficult time processing those certain foods and breaking them down for proper assimilation and fully digesting them properly. And it creates these surface level symptoms that we see behaviorally or physically, whether that's, they have eczema or some type of different rash or like that chicken skin type of bumpy skin. Sometimes that's a food sensitivity. Oftentimes that's a food sensitivity. Or when kiddos only want to eat chicken nuggets, they only want to eat pizza, and they only want to eat noodles, and they only want to eat these like white starchy foods. A lot of times those are high amounts of gluten and dairy, which contains the protein casein. And both gluten, the protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, and other gluten-containing grains, these proteins, structurally, for some children, are very difficult to digest. And some children do not have the proper enzymes that would break down these protein molecules to proper absorption and digestion. And these proteins are able to fit into opioid receptors and essentially create addictive opioid-like responses in the body and the brain. And what do we know about opioids? We know that they're addictive. We know that they cause constipation. We know that they cause zinc deficiency. It's very interesting because all of those things are commonly seen in children with complex picky eating when there is this biochemical craving, this drive, this like strong drive towards these foods. So again, those categories of consideration that I want us to think about within Venn diagram of the picky eating paradigm are medical, trauma, structural functional, biochemical nutritional, and behavioral environmental. And I'm going to go way deeper into all of this in my course, of course, and here on the podcast within my content across Speaking of Health and Wellness. But for now, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the picky eating paradigm and throw out some brief examples of different conditions and situations that would fall within each of these 5 categories and how they can and do always overlap each other. And what I really want to do is take away all of that focus on the above the iceberg behavioral environmental components that we talk about and think about all the time as a society, right? Like, we're always focused on what the child's not doing, they're not eating, and how the parent responds to this, like what is the appropriate response. But it's more than that. It's so much more than that. And the factors below the surface of trauma, medical, biochemical, nutritional, structural, functional, all these things, those have to be considered as well. So that's really why I wanted to introduce the picky eating paradigm, and we will continue to go deeper into these topics, but I hope that gives some insight to the other issues that could be interplaying in some way. Even if you, like, a lot of parents may not realize that a child's reflux could absolutely be related to their picky eating. And that's just one small example, but there are a lot, So a lot of people might say, well, just wait and see. Just see if they grow out of it, Well, according to Dr. Kay Toomey in her training, Picky Eaters, Problem Feeders, and ARFID, she did a deep, in-depth summary of the prevalence of these various conditions, and she indicated that the studies across the world have shown that it's about 17 to 30% of children on average will struggle with some type of feeding and or growth issue at some time during the first 10 years of their life. And of these 17 to 30% of children, only a third or half of these children will outgrow their quote picky eating challenges. So that means that the rest aren't, obviously, right? And so what I'm saying here is don't let it be something that you wait and see. If you are struggling with picky eating, if your child is struggling with complex picky eating, if you feel that your child falls more into that complex picky eating, problem feeding, potentially pediatric feeding disorder category, then you should consult with someone because there may be something else going on. Here are my top 3 strategies for picky eating. And I say top 3, but really, these are the top 3 that I thought of right now that I could recommend to all parents to get started. And it would work for essentially everybody across the board. So that's why I chose these 3. But also know that I have a free guide on my website, speakingofhealthandwellness.com, where you can go for a Nourishing Picky Eaters guide where I have 10 mealtime strategies and 5 gut healthy recipes that are gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, refined sugar-free, all the things free. And they are Picky Eater approved. And that was a collaboration with Vicky of the Happy Healthy Unicorn on Instagram. Her recipes always blow me away. And it's a great freebie guide to get you started. But here are 3 strategies. And then in addition to the guide, I think this will be a good starting point for you. Number 1, remove the pressure from your child and from yourself. There's no need for ultimatums at mealtimes. There's no need for force feeding, and it actually creates more of that stress response. It's not best practice. I know that some of us were raised on the 1 bite rule. I was. It wasn't consistent, but I did have nights where I had to have the 1 bite rule or the finish your plate rule, and research has shown us that those are not effective feeding techniques for children, and that they actually create more of a stress response that then is associated with that food. And when you're in that heightened stress state, you're actually turning off the child's rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system state, and you're putting them into more of a fight or flight response, which then turns off digestion, and now they're in that sympathetic state, and it's really like this whole body connection, right? And so we don't want it to feel anxious. And so remove the pressure from yourself, remove the pressure from your child. And then step 2, focus on the positive exposures and the positive interactions with foods, not focusing on consumption. So this would be outside of meal times and during meal times. So you could say, where can my child help me food prep? Can they help me chop? Can they help me scrape this food from the cutting board into the bowl? And we're asking them to be a big helper and help me. Even if we know that it's not a food they'll eat, maybe they can just get closer to it. Maybe they can see it, smell it, get some sensory exposure to it. Because again, if we're thinking about that 15 exposures, remember, we want to add a lot more than 15 if we're talking about a kiddo who has more complex picky eating. And so any exposure is a good thing when it's a good thing. If there's stress, then obviously it's not a positive exposure, right? But when you put a new food on your child's plate, the expectation should not be that they eat it. The expectation should just be that they tolerate it on their plate at first. If they tolerate it on their plate, great. Will they interact with it with their utensil? Will they talk about it? Will they acknowledge it? Will they touch it with their hand? Will they smell it? There's a whole sequence that you work through to help your child become more comfortable with foods. You could have your child help you pick out different produce at the grocery store. Teach them how to know when, for example, an avocado is ripe. You're squeezing different avocados at the store, or a peach or something like that, or maybe you're smelling different herbs or something like that, and there's no pressure to eat it, right? Because if you're at the grocery store, then that's not a setting where your child is expected to eat. So that anxiety around meal times isn't already present. So that's a great opportunity, is outside of meal times, because it feels less of a pressure situation, less of a pressure situation for the child. And then lastly, like I was talking about earlier, going back to just foundational, structural, functional issues, if your child is not properly positioned, the focus of their body is going to be on maintaining their posture upright in space, because that's the body's number 1 priority, right? And so if they're focused on that, they're not going to be in a place where they can focus on the mealtime. The proper seating position is the infamous, what feeding specialists refer to as the 90-90-90 seating. And basically, you want a 90-degree angle at the child's ankle where they have a place to ground their feet. You want a 90-degree angle at their knees, and then a 90-degree angle at the hips. And essentially, when they have that proper seating, they're able to stabilize their body, to ground their feet, to stabilize their core, and to put their cognitive focus and physical attention onto eating and chewing and swallowing. You may not realize this, but eating is actually a very complex task. And according to Feeding Matters, I'm pulling this right off of their website, because I love how they put it. A single swallow requires the use of 26 muscles and 6 cranial nerves, working in perfect harmony to move food and liquid through the body. When one or more pieces of the feeding puzzle are missing, out of order, or unclear, infants and children can have difficulty eating and drinking. And I love the way they said it, because it is such a complex task. And it's really a whole body task. And we need to make sure that they have that proper seating so that again, I always say, you guys, the foundations. This is something that's foundational in order for them to be successful. So in my free guide, Nourishing Picky Eaters, I have a link to one of my favorite high chairs that I was introduced to while I was working in early intervention. And it is the Kikaroo Height Right chair. I also like the Stokey chairs, but you can modify a high chair. You can modify many high chairs, I should say. Some of them are a lost cause. If they are in a position where you cannot get the child's pelvis out of a tilt, where the child's like tilting backwards, where they're basically having to do a crunch while they're sitting and eating. Can you picture what I'm talking about? Where you're like sitting and slouching and they're like having to do a sit-up while they're eating. Yeah, I would want to get down from the meal too, And so when I was working in early intervention, though, there were plenty of high chairs that I've used towels or, shoe boxes and duct tape or whatever to help a family modify their high chair to be in the appropriate angles for their child's seating. So for the other tips, on the tips that would be my very starting tips for families who have children who are complex picky eaters, you can go to speakingofhealthandwellness.com/freebies and find my Nourishing Picky Eaters Guide, 10 Mealtime Strategies with 5 recipes. And I hope that that's been helpful for you. I hope that this episode's been helpful for you, that the guide is helpful for you, and that you have more of a understanding of whether or not your child is a complex picky eater, a problem feeder, or whether they have a more developmentally appropriate phase of eating. And if you do feel like they have a more complex need, I encourage you to find a SLP or OT who is a pediatric feeding specialist, or whether that's someone locally to you or reaching out to me to see if we would be a good fit together. I encourage you to get some support for your child if you feel that they fall within that category, because they may not grow out of it, and it may cause more issues in the future related to nutrition or their structural or functional needs. We're back related to their palate and mouth development, things like that. And especially those biochemical and nutritional aspects, that is really a whole body issue. If you're not getting the nutrition that you need, if you're not getting what you need for your body to work properly, then of course there's going to be some sort of issue downstream that happens later on, whether that's a digestive issue or a learning issue because they're not receiving the proper nutrients for brain development, what have you. So we want to make sure that if there is complex picky eating, or if a child is a problem feeder or would fall into that diagnostic category of of pediatric feeding disorder, we want to make sure that we address it sooner rather than later. I hope this has been helpful for you. If it has, please let me know. Come join me on Facebook. Let me know on Instagram. Leave me a review on iTunes. It really does help the podcast be shown to more people and grow and get this information to more families. So, yeah. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your time. I hope that you are well. Take care and talk soon. Thanks again for listening to Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast. I'm so grateful you've taken the time. For any of the references mentioned in the show, head over to speakingofhealthandwellness.com. If this episode resonated with you or inspired you, it would mean so much to me if you took a moment to subscribe, write a review, share it on social media, or with someone in your life who could really benefit from this information. Your support helps this podcast and the overall message and mission of Speaking of Health and Wellness reach more people. If you share on Instagram, tag me so I can personally thank you for listening. If you're on Facebook, come join our free community group of like-minded parents and professionals. The direct link is in the podcast description. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again so much, and take care.